Welcome. In this video, we're going to be talking about migration or the movement of people across international borders. This can be due to several different causes, but we're going to focus in this video on refugees and what causes refugee crises and what's being done to try to address some of the problems of refugees movement across borders all around the globe. It's estimated that there are currently more than 122 million refugees around the globe. These are people who've been forcibly displaced. That means they've been forced to leave their countries, to leave their homes, to leave property behind. And this is due to a variety of reasons. It can be religious persecution, conflict within a country, violence, even violence perpetrated by gangs, by drug cartels, and so on. This can be due to human rights violations, climate disasters, economic inequality, and a variety of other issues. So, who qualifies as a refugee? So, the definition is simply a person who has crossed a national border into another country to escape conflict or persecution due to their race, religion, nationality, or membership in a particular social group, and is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin owing to a well-founded fear of further persecution or harm. So this is sort of a legal definition of refugee, which is important because for countries who harbor refugees, who allow for refugees to cross their borders and then provide some level of protection for them, these nations like the United States or other countries around the world who welcome refugees, there needs to be some distinction between who is a refugee, that is someone who's been forced to leave their home and their country because they fear for their own lives, versus just someone who is a migrant, someone who has left their country on their own will. They've left their own country as a choice that they've made rather than being forced to leave the country. And that's a really important legal distinction that we'll get into just a little bit more. So anyone who crosses a border into another country is not necessarily a refugee, of course. If someone makes a choice to cross a border, we call this person a migrant. This is a person who voluntarily leaves their home country to live in another country with better working or living conditions. So we know that people migrate for a variety of reasons. A lot of time it's for economic reasons. They want to find more economic opportunities, and they are looking for a better life for themselves and for their families, for their children, and so this is one of the main drivers of migration. A lot of times it's due to poor living conditions or poor economic conditions in their home country, but ultimately, when we describe someone as a migrant, there's an assumption being made that they had a choice, that they made a choice to come to cross a border and to go into another country, not because their life was being threatened, not because they were forced to, but because they chose to. So many countries welcome refugees to some extent. It doesn't mean open borders. It doesn't mean that anyone who calls themselves a refugee is allowed to enter a country and remain there. But countries like the U.S. have policies in place where they allow a migrant to declare themselves a refugee, and then that person is then required to appear in court and make an argument in front of an immigration judge on whether or not they qualify to be given refugee status. A lot of times that looks like that person trying to establish evidence and proof that they have a true cause for fearing for their own life and safety if they are to return to their home country. And so a judge will then decide whether that person has a valid case for receiving refugee status. And if the refugee status is granted, then that person is given a temporary permission to remain in the country. And contrary to maybe what people might see in the media, or maybe in some fringe elements of the sort of typically right wing media that leans more, I guess, oppositionally towards immigration. You see people make claims about refugees having just this really posh lifestyle, that they get all these government benefits, and the reality for that is that it's very hard to be a refugee. They don't get the same kind of status, even, or the same kind of opportunities that even, like, let's say, a green card holder would have. They receive some initial support that is very, very minimal, but then they have all these kinds of uh, checkpoints in their refugee journey in which they have to kind of meet requirements that the government puts in place for them, and they don't receive a lot of government help financially either. So it is an initial support that lasts for a few months, but then they're kind of on their own to make do, and it's really not a really easy road for people who get refugee status in the U.S. or any other country. It might be surprising to people that there are countries around the world that welcome far more refugees than the U.S. does annually. The U.S. has allowed for millions of refugees over the years, about 3 million since 1975. But currently, the U.S. is allowing very few refugees into the country. There are millions of people, not millions, I should say, there are thousands and thousands of people who have crossed the southern border of the U.S. and are seeking refugee status. Most of them will not receive refugee status and will be required legally to return to their home countries. However, outside of the southern border, it's very hard for someone to come to the U.S. and declare themselves a refugee or seek refugee status. Countries like Iran have welcomed about 3.8 million refugees in recent years. This is people mostly coming from Afghanistan. It's interesting to think about the fact that the U.S. military was based, or not based, but was present in Afghanistan up until just a few years ago. And there was a lot of conflict and war. Always there has been in Afghanistan. So those people have left Afghanistan to go to find safety in Iran. And as of the recording of this lecture, here in early 2026, the U.S. and Iran are now in a conflict, which makes life probably quite unsafe for people in Iran. So we may see people leaving Iran now and going to find refugee status in other countries in the region. Turkey also has had a lot of refugees as fallout from the Syrian conflict. We've seen many Syrian refugees make their way to Turkey, and so it isn't only the U.S. that allows refugees. We have allowed many over the years, but there are many countries now that are providing shelter and safety and protection for refugees other than just the United States. So I want to share with you some information from an agency called UNHCR. So it's the UN Refugee Agency. This is a report that they produce. And what we're going to be looking at is a report from 2021. Now, that is now 5 years ago. So, of course, there is a lot of this data, these statistics that have varied since this report was first issued. But I think I actually went and looked up at this at the UN Refugee Agency's current website, and while some of these statistics have changed very slightly. A lot of it still holds true as of 2024. So, the data here on refugees isn't always updated, every single year, but there's trends that we can look at that hold true over a pretty long period of time. So we're going to look at some of this information from 2021, and we can kind of assume that a lot of these statistics and a lot of this information is still true, and gives at least some idea of where the status is of refugees today. So again, these are statistics from 2021, but I think I looked back at the UN website on refugees. Currently, they had statistics there from 2024. So these are not updated every single year, but the number of displaced people was down a little bit in 2024 to around, I believe, 77 million people. But still, we're talking about tens of millions of people who are displaced as a result of persecution, conflict, and violence. And in 2021, most of the refugees came from just 5 countries. Those would be Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. We're going to look at a map in just a little bit that will give you a little better look of where those countries fall around the globe if you're not already aware of where they fall geographically. But I think we can probably assume that in Syria and Afghanistan, at least, it's the ongoing conflicts that involve even the U.S. That have led to a lot of this disruption and a lot of the displacement. Whereas in places like Myanmar, South Sudan, and Venezuela, it's more internal issues that have driven people away, and to people to find new homes and new countries across borders. So Turkey hosts nearly 3.8 million refugees. It has the largest population of refugees in the world. Colombia is second with more than 1.8 million. There are around 41% of refugees that are children. So it says children only make up about 30% of the world's population, but they account for about 41% of all displaced people. So if you think about that, when we talk about refugees and we look at these statistics, remember that nearly half of those refugees that we're referring to, whether it be 89 million or 77 million globally, we're talking about nearly half of those being children. And I believe that is people that are 18 or under are considered children in this statistic. So that's pretty startling to think about. And I think it should shape in some ways the way we think about immigrants and about refugees. Sorry, I'm kind of using those interchangeably. I shouldn't be, but it should shape the way we think about refugees when we consider what a large portion of them are actually children who certainly have no control over their own lives or their own decisions regarding migrating from one country to another or trying to escape from conflict or economic crisis or so on. So it really deserves, I think, a lot of our attention to consider how we can help deal with this kind of a problem, particularly these children who have been forced out of their homes and their countries. So the USA does receive the most individual asylum claims. We receive most of those from the southern border, as I mentioned earlier. And that's because people can enter the U.S. from the southern border. They enter technically illegally, but they do have a legal right to then seek asylum once they've arrived. And that's the court process I was describing earlier, where they can seek asylum, they can make a claim in front of a judge. Now, the problem we're facing in the United States right now, and it is getting better, but we've had an underfunded court system that is very slow. And so a lot of times when these people who are seeking refugee status, when they apply for asylum, they often are waiting many years to actually go before a judge and plead their case. And so, what do we do with those people while they're waiting? Well, the practice in the past has been to kind of allow them out into society. But the problem with that is that they don't have support structures in place. It's hard for them to find jobs. Many times they don't speak English, so they're limited in what jobs they could do, even if they had the legal status to work. And so it creates a lot of crisis for them because they can't go home, because home is dangerous, and yet they can't receive any kind of legal status because they're waiting on that court date to claim asylum. And so, or to, sorry, to not to claim asylum, they've already claimed it, but to receive refugee status. And what's even more tragic is that, after waiting many years, many of them are denied that refugee status because it's really hard to prove that your life is threatened back home. A lot of people don't have evidence for that, and I will grant that there are people who make that claim who don't really have a life or death threat at home, but are really just seeking more economic security and safety here in the U.S. or whatever country they might have migrated into. So it's a difficult situation. The judges, these immigration attorneys and judges, have to carefully consider each case, because you can't just allow a open border system where people fled into the country without any kind of legal right or reason to be in that country. So on your screen, you see some stats from 2021 about global displacement. It's interesting, even though these statistics are a little dated. What's interesting to think about is what was going on in 2020, 2021, 2022 when we look at these statistics. That was during the global pandemic. So not only were these people being forced from their homes and their countries, they were also trying to live in a pandemic situation where many borders were shut. Travel was very difficult. Sometimes, the normal channels for travel were shut down. A lot of times people couldn't even enter other countries legally. There was no way to enter a country because many countries put stipulations on the flow of humans into their countries due to the fear of spreading COVID. And so it was just a very difficult time to difficult time to be a refugee, on top of all the other difficulties that they're dealing with in their home country that forced their departure. So on your screen, you see top 5 countries of origin for refugees. You see, of course, Syria and Afghanistan. We know that there have been ongoing conflicts in that region. Myanmar also has has internal political turmoil that has forced a lot of people out of the country. South Sudan has had internal, and so has Venezuela. So a lot of these countries have issues going on within the country that creates a hostile, unsafe environment, and many people in those countries have chosen to leave and to find safety other places. So on your screen, you see the top 10 refugee hosting countries, with Turkey, which was formerly known as Turkey, sometimes still referred to as Turkey, has about 3.8 million refugees. So they're at the top of that list, with Germany, Colombia, Uganda, Pakistan, all kind of being in the more than 1 million refugees currently. Again, these numbers are from 2021, so it's possible that some of the countries on this list have shifted a bit. But since 2014, Turkey has hosted the largest population of refugees in the world. And in 2021, the country remained the largest refugee hosting country with close to 4 million refugees, with 15% of all displaced people across all borders. So about 83% of refugees are hosted by low and middle income countries. That means that the countries with the strongest performing economies are not necessarily the countries that host the most refugees. So who are refugees? About 48% of refugees are women and girls. So about half of all refugees are women and girls, which are more susceptible to human trafficking and other types of issues that might threaten them. About 41% of displaced people are children below the age of 18. So that's a higher percentage than the portion of children that in the global population. So they're about 30% of the global population are people under 18, but about 41% of the refugee population. So it's a quite a large chunk of the refugee population. And then about 1.5 million children are born as refugees or were born as refugees between 2018 and 21. So that means the children are actually born in a state where the family does not have a stable place to call home. They're in transit or in flux between at least two locations, and in some cases they've moved from one country into another country and then been forced to move again into another country. And so it's a really difficult environment to be born into and to try to raise a child in. We mentioned before about asylum claims in the United States, and the U.S. does receive the highest number of asylum claims. What that means is someone who has crossed into the U.S. Without legal status, who then claims to have some kind of a threat or some kind of a danger that they're facing in their home country. And they're asking for asylum, protection, and refugee status within the United States. So in 2021, about 188,900 asylum claims were filed in the United States. Of that, you can see on the screen about 13,700 refugees were resettled in the United States. So that's just a small percentage, about 5% or so of the asylum claims were actually granted refugee status. So that gives you a sense of how difficult it is for someone to be granted refugee status in the U.S. Maybe also it points to how slow the process is, even though you had close to 200,000 asylum claims, only 5% or so were actually processed. So it's a slow process, and then hopefully we'll see improvement in that area, in the future. And then globally, you see there are about 4.6 million asylum claims around the world in 2021. That was up slightly over 2020, the year 2020, when we had about 4.2 million. And then there's a final stat there: 27,000 unaccompanied minors or separated children were refugees. So that's children that are traveling as or seeking asylum without an adult that to be there to help them and to watch over them. So unaccompanied minors or separated children from their parents, 27,000 globally. So so it's a real issue, and I know that even in the U.S. on our southern border, there's a lot of discussion of children being separated from parents. That's a controversy that has raged in the U.S., a debate that's raged here for the last 5 or 6 years. And then you also have the case of a lot of unaccompanied minors. This would be, in many cases, like teenage males, in some cases females, but a lot of times it's teenage male immigrants or migrants who come up from Latin America and Central America, and they are seeking work, but they're still minors. They're still not fully adults, And so the system in the U.S., the immigration system, has to kind of handle them a little differently because they don't have an adult or parent to watch over them, to care for them while they're here in the States. So, immigration is a really complex topic. I don't pretend to have all of the answers, but I have a few ideas for what I think might move us in the right direction, at least, and that might help improve the situation in the U.S., but also improve the situation for the really millions of people globally who are displaced and needing a safe place for them, for a safe place to live, to have work, to provide for their families, to thrive, which is what we ultimately we want. We want our own nation to thrive. We want our own economy, our own people to thrive, but we also want those who have lost their country, who have lost their homes, to also be given the same opportunities, if and when possible. So here are a few ideas. I have 5 ideas that I'll mention really quickly. Again, these don't fix all of our problems, but they maybe move us in the right direction. Number one, I do think it's important to secure the border, and I think this can mostly be done with technology. And there are places where it will make strategic sense to use physical barriers to secure the border, but a lot of times it's not necessarily a giant wall or any kind of large structure that's going to keep people from migrating into the U.S., but it's actually technology that can be used to minimize the number of immigration or border patrol officers that are needed, and that can help find migrants who might be in the desert in dangerous situations and so on. So I think there should be a more technological approach to this, more so than an attempt to blockade the entire southern border with some kind of physical barrier. Although physical barrier, where needed, where helpful, should be used. Number two, I think we need to streamline the process for asylum claims. This probably means opening up more courts, having more judges who can look at and either deny or approve asylum cases. And this would help move people through that process more quickly. It would make it more efficient. It would reduce waiting time so that when someone does make a claim, they're not stuck waiting in limbo for several years before they can see a judge. So I think that would be a really key improvement. Number three, I think we need to create a robust worker program to allow for migrant workers to enter the country when needed for very specific and strategic types of jobs that benefit the U.S. economy. I'll give an example. So there are certain times of the years when American farmers need to harvest their crops, right? And migrant workers do a lot of that work. And the truth is that there's not enough American workers who are willing or looking for that kind of work, and so it's beneficial to the U.S. to have access to a migrant workforce who will enter the country during that season when harvesting is taking place. They come in, they work, and that benefits the U.S. economy. It benefits the workers themselves, and I think long term it can benefit the workers in an even larger way than just providing them with a good paying job for a season. But I think these workers who have entered the country on temporary worker visas and then who have worked and lived in the U.S. over a set period of time, maybe 5 years, 10 years, they then should be kind of at the head of the line, at the front of the line, in programs that would give them some kind of a pathway to like permanent residency or eventually even citizenship. If they've come here for year after year and they've worked and they've paid taxes and they've not committed crimes and they've been really productive members of communities, then I think they should have the right to be able to apply for a green card and eventually citizenship. Number four, I think you need to provide some kind of a path to legal status for adults who are living in America now, but were brought here as children illegally. So, in other words, these were what we've called dreamers in the past. But I do think that there needs to be a way for those people, because they've lived most of their lives in the U.S. They are, in the cultural sense, they are American. English might be their only language, first, their first language, but maybe in some cases their only language. Even though they don't have legal status in every other way and every other metric, they are American. So I think that we have to find a way for them to become fully recognized members of our society. So dreamer programs, things that open up the door for them to become part of America. And then finally, number 5, I would like to see the U.S. lead the way in a global effort to help establish refugee resettlement programs that meet a high standard of care and security, so that countries can feel secure in allowing refugees to come in and, to resettle. This would be a strategic plan where they would work with partners around the world globally. It could be led through the United Nations, or whatever intergovernmental agencies were appropriate, to try to create like a system where no single country is burdened heavily by moments of crisis, where we've had several times where war has broken out in a certain region of the world, and then all of the refugees rush into one particular country, and that's really, really difficult for one country to absorb. The need is great, and it doesn't mean that those refugees are a burden themselves. It just means that the system isn't built for such a flux in population. And so I feel like the U.S. could lead the way in helping create like a network of nations that could spread the responsibility a bit whenever we have moments of crisis around the globe, that they would be able to help find places around the world for these refugees to go to resettle, to restart their lives. And that to me seems very American, to lead the way in that kind of an effort.